Well, I guess I was bound to have an interest in Iron Maiden sooner or later. 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple is the sequel to 28 Years Later from last year. Nia DaCosta in the director's chair, Ray Fiennes returns, Jack O'Connell, who appeared in the ending of the last movie, is in here too. Alfie Williams returns as Spike, and a few other people you may or may not recognize, especially with the movie's ending, but we'll get to that later. Continuing where the last movie left off with Spike joining this cult led by Jimmy, Jack O'Connell's character, and he's thrust into these certain situations where he sees some horrific things happen as a result of this cult, trying to find his way out of it, but also feeling like he can't exactly escape it. All coming to a head in the finale with Dr. Kelson, who Jimmy seems to have a very big interest in. Not going to talk about absolutely everything, but I will talk about some details with this movie, so if you don't want to know anything, there's your warning. I also want to apologize to you guys for getting this out as late as I did. I was going to try to get it out by like Sunday or Saturday-ish, but my work schedule caught up with me. We also had some heavy snowfall coming in over where I live, which only added more fuel to the fire as far as the busyness of my schedule. And there was a couple other instances where I had to kind of take a pause and take a rest. I'm not going to get into any of that, but I'm here now to talk about Bone Temple, so let's get to it. For anyone who may or may not know, I am a relatively newcomer to the series 28 Days Later, or the 28 Years Later. I'm going to call it the 28 Days Later series, since it all started back in 2002 with 28 Days. Since 28 Years Later was coming up last year, I decided to do my homework, and thanks to the encouragement of one of my followers who's a big fan of the series, I thought, you know what? Why not? Let's give it a try. I've been hearing a lot about this, so let's see what this series is all about. Days, I think, is really good, probably still the best in the series by far. 28 Weeks Later, not horrible, but I would say it's probably the weakest of the series. And of course, with 28 Years Later, a lot of people have had things to say about that too, mostly in regards to its ending. I don't disagree with that, but I actually really like the movie. There's a couple of nitpicks I have here and there outside of the way it ends. Like as far as how does the rest of the world able to adapt when at the end of 28 Weeks Later, it was hinted in the credits that the virus was starting to spread outside of the UK, and they somehow managed to contain the virus to the British Isles. But even with some of that stuff in the way the movie wraps up, the emotional weight with Spike and his mother I thought really saved it for me. But now we have 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, where Spike is dragged into this cult led by Jimmy, and all the other people in the group are called Jimmy. And Spike is forced to experience some pretty unthinkable horrors, even more so than what he experienced the first time around in 28 Years Later. You also have that story along with Dr. Kelson, who's struggling to find a way to survive on his own, but also having somebody to talk to in the form of Samson, this infected alpha male who he keeps around as basically his guard dog. Now, as someone who really liked the last movie in spite of its ending, I can definitely tell you this is an improvement. I would say probably second best in the entire series. I had to give it a lot of thought, but to be honest with you, I think it's really, really close to eclipsing 28 Days, just ever so slightly right behind the first one. And it has a lot of the similar things we come to expect in this series. It's very erratic, and it has a grainy look to it as opposed to Danny Boyle's direction in the last one, where it was all filmed on an iPhone camera with a very crispy look where you're able to actually see just how run down the whole world is in that area. DaCosta manages to translate some of that here, but it has a more artsy indie feel to it, which I think kind of fits in with the tone that the first two films had. And it almost at certain times kind of felt like a found footage movie, although I think the first one had a lot more of that in that area. And if I had to guess, I think Nia DaCosta is more from that side of cinema, the indie art house background, even though she has made a blockbuster beforehand in The Marvels from 2023. Not exactly a great thing to brag about. You can check out my review that I did at the time. It was more or less a crowd pleaser, but she had a capability to her to deliver something really fun. And in this one, while it's obviously not in the same category as the MCU, with a franchise like the 28 Days Later series, there's going to be some sort of gravitas by now. And with DaCosta's style, I think she manages to fit in just fine. I gotta admit, I do kind of miss the look and feel of the last one, but I don't expect every movie in the series to stay the same. And that's more or less what you come to expect in other series or franchises like Star Wars, the MCU, Dark Knight Trilogy, Mission Impossible, and so on. All have a similar tone and style, but they also feel very different, which is important to make certain entries stand out from each other. Part of that is also due to the cinematographer Sean Bobbitt, who collaborated with director Steve McQueen on 12 Years a Slave some time ago. There's a certain type of depth that he's able to bring with the imagery in here that makes you feel like you're actually there, and not everything is so crispy and clean and shiny. Given that this is the apocalypse, you kind of have to show the lived-in, run-down nature of it all. And just like in the previous entries, the cinematography is also at times very erratic, which I actually think is a really nice illustration of just how crazy and unhinged the infected really are. Similar to the infected in The Last of Us, where they're all like, blah, 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 blah. I was kind of surprised by how close in proximity the release dates were from each other with Bone Temple and 28 Years Later, but I did a little research and it looks like they actually shot these back to back. I guess Sony and the filmmakers were pretty confident about how these two films were going to go, and this more more or less feels like a middle chapter. There's obviously going to be a sequel at some point down the line. I mean, if the ending is any indication. But since I mentioned this being a middle chapter, it follows a similar trope that middle chapters of a trilogy tend to do, where it's probably the most darkest and most violent, or maybe even really deeper than the previous entry, because usually that's how a trilogy goes. You have to ease people into the pool by dipping their toes in the water. Now that you're in the pool, you could go really crazy and all out with your swimming. I would argue this is probably the most violent the series has ever gotten. There's a certain fight scene that happens in the opening of the movie where Spike has to do a fight to the death against this one other Jimmy, and he ends up cutting the guy's leg, severing his artery. And I'm not going to go too graphic beyond that, but watching that, I almost started to feel nauseous. And I don't usually feel that way with certain movies. I've seen violent content from movies like Saving Private Ryan, Passion of the Christ, and so on. This was probably the most unsettling that I've ever felt. And I'm not saying that as a detriment against the film. There's just certain times, along with other stuff that they do in here, that made me go, oh my god, dear God. And I thought both iterations of The Last of Us were violent. On top of that, with Jimmy's cult, when they come across certain people in a certain area that are closed off from what's going on outside their walls, the ones that don't manage to get away, they either kill them or they hang them in the barn and they skin them. My stomach is already starting to shake. Well, we'll just leave it at that. But since how I mentioned in my previous reviews how this is very similar, I think, to some story tropes in The Last of Us, this I think is a mixture of David's group from Last of Us Part 1 along with the Seraphites from Last of Us Part 2. The way Jimmy's cult tortures these people is very similar to how the Scars torture the Wolves or the WLF soldiers. And with Jimmy's group being a cult, just like David's group being a religious cult, although I would say they're a lot more unhinged and dangerous than David's group was. But as opposed to David, who actually believes in what he's doing, Jimmy knows that he's feeding a bunch of baloney to his followers, which is evident in his conversation with Dr. Kelson when he realizes that he's not actually Old Neck, or the devil, as he makes it out to be to his followers. He goes on these things about how he actually manages to talk to his father, which I assumed at first was his father, the preacher, at the beginning of the last movie, who ended up getting killed by the infected. But no, he's actually talking about the devil. And if you notice from the cross that's hanging on his neck upside down, you should know that's not a good sign. And if history is any indication with this kind of person.
Because the only thing worse than a tyrant is a tyrant who thinks they're on a mission from God.
But I actually really like that conversation he has with Dr. Kelson. It's the one moment where he's actually able to put down all that bravado and actually kind of relate to him on a human level, more or less. And we see that Jimmy does want to achieve this kind of accomplishment, but on his part, it's more of an act of desperation. Because I think he might sense that some of his followers are not believing in what he's saying. Such as the one girl who goes by Kelly, who you might recognize from the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV show. On the note of the leader Jimmy, Jack O'Connell, who you might remember from Sinners from last year, both characters are very similar in how they want to control people. This guy, I would say, is slightly more scary and terrifying than Remick, although Remick being a vampire, that kinda puts him in a disadvantage. But even so, nothing worse than a tyrant who believes they're on a mission from God. Props to Jack O'Connell, because that character is terrifying, and he manages to deliver that and then some. There's a couple of things that happen where I actually really like that they kinda do a subversion of expectations, and that does get a bad rap because of certain movies. But in this case, I think they managed to pay it off, because Spike has an opportunity to kill the one survivor that didn't get caught. He spares her life and he offers to go with her, but she kicks him in the stomach and takes off. Whereas I thought that she was actually going to show him some mercy since he showed her mercy. But of course, I can be extremely naive, because in the apocalypse, it's survival of the fittest. But on the note of Ralph Fiennes' character, Dr. Kelson, after everything he did for Spike and his mother, he's still carrying on his usual routine about honoring the dead and giving them a rightful burial and ceremony. But he's also befriending his guard dog infected, Samson, by giving him shots of morphine, which helps him calm down. And as the film goes on, we start to realize that this might actually be a potential cure for the virus inside of his mind. He gives him morphine every day that he shows up, but as we all know, since he has a limited supply, he's going to eventually run out. He considers euthanizing him, but then Samson starts to say the word moon. We, the audience, along with Dr. Kelson, realize, oh my god, we might actually have a cure for this. As opposed to The Last of Us, where Ellie's immunity wasn't exactly clear on whether or not it was going to cure the infection. I could be totally wrong about this. I don't know if Alex Garland took any ideas from The Last of Us, but I see this as more of an expansion on the idea of whether or not this cure for the infection could actually work from The Last of Us. And I guess you could say Dr. Kelson is kind of like Bill, who lives on his own and doesn't really trust anybody or not really letting anybody in. Although the difference is, Bill is very distrustful of everybody, even Joel. Whereas Dr. Kelson, he is willing to let certain people in as long as he knows that he's not going to have any trouble with them. But there is actually a really neat scene with Samson when he ends up on the train where we saw him behead that one soldier from the last movie. He's gotten enough of a dose of morphine where he starts to have this hallucination, and he remembers a certain memory of him on the train when he was in human form, further emphasizing the idea that the medicine that Dr. Kelson is giving him could potentially lead to a cure for the infected. But then when he goes back to his human form, the infected in the train start to realize what's going on, and they attack him as if he's not infected. So they have this innate sense, I suppose, where they can see if someone's in a human form or not, consciously or cognitively or physically, whatever. As soon as that one ticket person from the train started to go, I thought, oh shit. Yeah, the infected in the train caught onto it. You're in trouble. But then there's the climax of the movie where they all go to the Bone Temple thinking that Dr. Kelson is the devil. And he puts on this big show covering himself in all this red and white powdered makeup all over his body, giving all the people there these hallucinogens, playing a song by Iron Maiden, The Number of the Beast. We saw this kind of stuff in the trailers and on the poster, which I think most people, including myself, thought, what's that all about? But thankfully there's a reason for that, and the way they carry it out here, not taking itself too seriously, but somehow, it was kind of amazing. Like, they actually managed to get away with it without making it unintentionally hilarious. Like I said earlier, I think I have more of an excuse to listen to Iron Maiden from now on. So they go through all the list of demands that Jimmy has for him, but then Kelson realizes that Spike is one of the followers, and he throws a little wrench into the plan by demanding that Jimmy sacrifice himself like Jesus did. But Jimmy, out of desperation to keep the ruse alive, stabs Dr. Kelson, then Kelly starts to turn on the other cultists. Not one word of a lie when Spike stabs Jimmy. I literally thought of this moment from Sinners. And again, another Last of Us comparison, but Spike and Kelly teaming up with each other, just like Abby and Lev in Last of Us Part 2. And both of them are escaping from a cult. And I thought for a little while that Kelly was going to turn on Spike and that he'd have to kill her instead and fend for himself. But I like that the movie didn't try to throw us yet another wrench into the plan, that they showed she was a caring person and she allowed Spike to just hang around outside while Jimmy and the rest of the guys were skinning those people inside the barn. She had just enough of kindness deep down to go, yeah, okay, let's not go there. But with Samson returning to thank Dr. Kelson in his dying moments, I really hope that they dig deep into that, if anything. Because if it really is just confined to the British Isles, I'd be very curious to see how they manage to slowly pick themselves back up together again, if that's what's meant to be the plot of the next movie anyway. But I also think it's kind of ironic in how Jimmy ends up being crucified by being literally nailed to a wooden cross, but also hung upside down, just like the crucifix he wore around his neck. And that flash of infected that we get that attacks him, I actually thought that was Samson that managed to lose it and go back to his primitive instincts. But no, since he came back from the train, I guess that's yet another infected, because now I actually remember he carried Dr. Kelson's body away. And the rest of the infected that were chasing him from the train saw Jimmy and, well, you know. There's also a moment that I forgot to mention with Samson and how Dr. Kelson dances with Samson when he's in a suppressed state with the morphine. Another moment that you would think on paper would not translate well, but somehow with this type of humor that the movie presents, they somehow managed to get away with it. And coming from me as an American, I would say the British, they have the best humor in this entire universe. I'm sorry if I upset anyone by saying that, but I'm willing to admit that. But as far as its ending, Cillian Murphy returns as Jim, who's living with his daughter in this nearby house where they see Spike and Kelly running away from a horde of infected, and they rush over to help them. And obviously this is his daughter, but is this Selena's daughter? I think it's safe to assume so. We don't know exactly what's going on with her, if she's alive or she just left. Obviously, that's going to lead to some questions on what's going to happen in the sequel, but it is really neat to see the OG from the original film return once again, even if it's an uncredited appearance, which I heard leading up to this movie that he was going to show up somehow. I assumed it was going to be a mid-credit scene or post-credit scene, but I really like how they just shoved it right into the final moment. I mean, it is a cool way to bring it all full circle if the next movie is meant to be the last in this trilogy, going back to the one who started it all. As far as problems go, I'm not really sure if there's anything I can really focus on. I guess tonally it's a little uneven, although a lot better in comparison to the last movie, with the ending anyway. But yeah, in regards to Bone Temple, safe to say that 2026 has started with a bang. An improvement over the last movie, and I would say second best in the entire series, right behind 28 Days Later. And I'm really curious to see where they take the next one. So that's all I have for you guys on 28 Years Later Bone Temple. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie if you've seen it, and what's your favorite in the series. My personal favorite is this one along with the first movie. Hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.